Welcome back to our History Series event. Tonight's talk, like many before, discusses historical events and cultural ideologies. My name is Katie McKinney, and I'm the founder and head of school of the Classical Academy de Lafayette. We are a classical private school in partnership with Hillsdale College, and we're bringing the Western tradition back to education. We serve students kindergarten through 11th grade, and next year will be a very exciting year. We will graduate our first two graduates as we offer kindergarten through 12th grade. As many of you know, this History Series program grew out of a consistent request from parents and our wider community desiring a similar education as to what is offered here at Cal. So many times after hearing about our classical curriculum, parents who were touring the school would often leave the tour saying, "How do I get this education?" So we offer this adult education for our more seasoned students. Before we begin our educational program, I wanted to share with you an exciting event. Many of you know that we have a shooting team called the Patriots. They shoot trap and skeet. And since last year, we've grown from 12 athletes to 19. Next year, we expect we'll come close to 25 athletes. This year has been a turning point year for the Cal Patriots. In only our second season, Cal athletes have placed individually as a team, or both in every competition in which we have competed. And some of those were the two largest this last year. In July, the team traveled to Ohio to compete in the SCTP Nationals, where they competed against 5,000 other youth shooters from all over the country. And later that same month, we traveled to Sparta, Illinois, to compete in what's called the AIM or AIM Grand American. We are quickly becoming one of the best shooting teams in the region. So to that end, I wanted to invite you to our second annual Cal Patriots fundraiser. It'll be held on November 4th, that's a Friday, and there's an opportunity to participate in a pre-sale raffle leading up to the event. Our pre-sale raffle includes the Black Rain AR-15 and the Wicked Ridge crossbow. The tickets are $25 and more information will be sent out shortly. The drawing will be held the night of the races, November 4th. And if you're not interested in either the AR or the crossbow, we'd just love to have you come join us in person. It's an extremely fun event and it's for a good cause to support our talented athletes. So be on the lookout for more information. Our speaker tonight, Keith Preston, has had an interest in elections ever since his third grade teacher removed him from eligibility for class president because of some fake news involving school glue and some paper punch-outs. We're still waiting to hear about that story. Mr. Preston began his interest in the art of politics when he was witness to a protest at a George Wallace rally in 1968. The protesters consisted mainly of Richard Nixon and Eugene McCarthy supporters. These people were at the extreme opposite of the political spectrum, and as he tells his classes frequently, in politics and in war, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. His memory of that very unusual but temporary allegiance led to a lifetime of a fascination with the democratic idiosyncrasies of the American Republic. Mr. Preston has a passionate love of country, and it's manifested every day here in the classrooms at Cal. But he's also very mindful that the fact that human beings can be funny creatures and that humans are the ones who make up our electorate, and they're very unique. Our nation is proud of our quirks, and we cherish the strange and unusual in the freest, most liberty-drenched nation on the planet. This has led to some great stories regarding elections, and some of them involving our most hallowed leaders of history. So let's get started and help me welcome Mr. Keith Preston.
Time and when I tell this to students, they're always stunned. The private handwritten ballot is relatively new to the history of elections. Until that time, you all met in town, and everybody for Andrew Jackson, and and everybody for John Quincy Adams or whatever, and that's the way it was done. There was no privacy to it at all. And that's the reason why we get to 1860, you'll see the 10 of the 11 states, which ended up making up the Confederacy, had no votes for Abraham Lincoln, because that would be the end of your time in that town or that township if you were one of those people that voted for those terrible Republicans during the 1860 election. So anyway, we're going to get started here on talking about some of these. Let's see if I can get this to work right here for me. Yes, okay. So one of the first that we talk about, and actually both classes, both our middle school class, my history class, have recently been talking about that, and we've been memorizing this as well, and that's the Mayflower Compact, because it kind of sets an expectation for what you would have coming to the New World. Now, you know, when you come to the New World in 1620 on the Mayflower, the king is the king, the parliament's the parliament, but he's an ocean away. They're an ocean away. So to a great extent, you're going to be responsible for your own governance. You're going to be responsible for your own rules. If anything's going to get built, you're going to have to tax yourself somehow. And so the Mayflower Compact, well, we think of it as, oh, these are all these pilgrims, you know, they're out there doing things because of their religious freedom desires. That's true, but they were a minority on the boat. Majority of the people on the Mayflower were not of that religious sect. Okay, so the decision was made. We have to all agree that we're going to elect a board of people to make rules, and that we're all going to agree to abide by those rules, or you aren't allowed to get off the boat. And if you've ever seen mock-ups of the Mayflower, it's not much bigger than this room. Okay, so you've gone a couple of months across the Atlantic, boy, are you ready to get off there? They land in the wrong place. They're supposed to land in Northern Virginia. Suddenly they go, Massachusetts, okay. So you're not going to be allowed to get off until you sign the compact. You've agreed to it. And so this is this thing that we often do, is that we have some way to either choose representatives or to make our will known in a vote and then abide by the decision under the rules. And we do this to this day. When I talk to the kids about this, I said, how many of you get in the car and mom and dad or one of them says, where do we want to go for dinner tonight? You got McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, whatever it is, and you have to find a way to make a consensus. And oftentimes what will happen, most parents, you know, it will be a decision by the benevolent dictatorship of mom and dad or something like that. They can't all agree on something. But they agree that they're going to be run by these rules. And they know this is going to be under the king's rules. So the rules are going to be governed by the election of this local government. And again, in these early days, everything is visible. You know each other. You know who the neighbor is. You know the things that they do. Everybody knows everybody. So when you get there to vote, you're usually not going to be surprised. And you're probably going to know how the vote's going to go even before you get together to vote. But for a long period of time, that is how voting is going to go on in America. It really changes right before the turn to the 1900s. And the term for what we call the secret ballot, the written ballot, the paper ballot, it's called the Australian ballot. And I've seen different reasons, people, why it's called the Australian. I'm thinking, okay, it happened in Australia. No, I don't know. Just the way Australian crawl and swimming or something like that. But anyway, the ballot itself, the written ballot, isn't going to come for a while. So all this we're talking about until we get to around the turn of the century is going to be the actual individual votes will be in town with everyone watching. And that's why you'll often see that, you know, it might be 100% of the vote in a certain town. And that's because even the 5% are thinking maybe don't agree with it. They're either not going to go vote or they're not going to raise their hands, because then you won't do business. You won't be able to do business with the rest of the day. You're going to have to move if you voted differently than everyone else. So that's what we're looking at. Okay, and this is another thing I remind people when we talk about the American Revolution. We want independence. We want freedom for England. Remember that from 1620, and I don't count Jamestown in this because Jamestown is a corporate settlement. It is not like these other settlements. They're going to be people are coming here. The charter has been given. They set up their own community. Jamestown is a company town. It's owned by a group originally called the London Company. They become the Virginia Company. And so they're kind of in a different way. They're not going to be doing a lot of voting for a while. But we start with this Mayflower Compact, and as each one of these colonies gets set up, they're each going to have their own local voting. They're going to have their own colonial legislatures. And so from 1620 to when we eventually say we want to be independent, you've got 11 generations of people who are used to making decisions on their own. So when the American Revolution comes along, it's, you know, when they say no taxation without representation, that's because for 11 generations, that's the way it's been done. We need to have a road done here. All right, let's get together and we're going to vote. And who could vote in those days? Only people who own property. You know, if I went to college, they'd probably say, see, it's the 1% and all that. No, because those are the only guys that had money to pay taxes. You had property, you paid taxes. You paid taxes, that went to do something which was going to benefit everybody, especially the people who owned property. Why? Because they paid the taxes. So it made sense to people that if you had property, you got taxed. If you had property, you got the vote, because you would be the one who would be paying the taxes that eventually the legislature would then be deciding to do. So we see that beginning right away. Shortly after the Pilgrims kind of begin to fizzle out in Plymouth, you get the Puritans come over, who are a direct line from England, as opposed to England to Holland to America, which is what the Pilgrims are, directly from England, and they set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony. People that can't agree with what's been decided by the elected group of people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony say, they get told, hey, Roger Williams, hey, Ann Hutchinson, you've broken the rules, goodbye, you're out, you're exiled. And so they go over nearby to Rhode Island. They go to the Narragansett Indians, say, we'd like to buy some land here, and we just want to have our own little stuff. That's fine, okay, come on in. And that's how Rhode Island has, and they set up their own method of electing people and choosing. So each time, each of these colonies are going to do that. The most famous one is the Virginia House of Burgesses. If you've been to visit Williamsburg, you've seen where the Virginia House of Burgesses used to meet, where young men cut their teeth on representative government. A Jefferson and Washington, those people would have early on been elected body in their counties and maybe eventually chosen to go to the Virginia House of Burgesses. So all these people have had a long period of time and a history in their family and their culture of what they thought of as their country. I've got my middle school class right now learning a little bit about the Boston Massacre and John Adams being the lawyer in that. And at one point in time, he's asked, you know, how can you stand to live here with these people? He says, Massachusetts is my country, which in 1770 to John Adams it was. So to all these people, this is their country. They're British citizens living in these colonies that are their country. And that some of them, as I said, have been here a long time, very long time. So this is the breeding ground for America's elected governments. And in many ways, it's going to be also an experimentation. What works? What doesn't work? What are the problems that come up? How do you deal with this? Now, this is going to be theirs alone to do for a long time, especially in the middle part of the 17th century. In the mid-1600s, there's a civil war going on in England. And so they're pretty much watching what's going on with that. There's the king, and he gets executed, and a war, and Cromwell, and all these things are going on. While over in America, they're going, nobody's watching. I describe it this way to the kids. Mom and dad have gone to bed early, and you can have all the ice cream you want, okay? So that's what they're doing there. They're going to the West Indies and trading with the Spanish. They're going to all these places. And each time they go there, they're making more money. And so their view of what their elected government should do is to help them make that happen and continue. They have an opportunity here that they did not have in England. They have the opportunity for land. They have an opportunity for their own business. And most importantly, they have an opportunity to pass this on to their children and so on, which a lot of times you don't have in England. Those of you who watch Downton Abbey, you notice the fact that the only guy that really owns the land there is Lord Grantham. Everybody else, all the guys that work around there, are all renting. They can't own their land. It's taken up by all the nobles and the government there. Here in America, you have a chance, okay? And so their idea of what elected government should do is to allow them to do the things to make this continue to grow. Their second sons, a lot of them never would have been anything in England, but they've got a lot of land here in the New World, and they can succeed and do anything they want, okay? And they did pay taxes. They knew they needed to have tax money to keep them. We need the docks to be fixed. How can we bring in our ships to the, okay, we're going to vote a 1 penny tax on anything imported. Fine. They would do that themselves. And we're getting into the American Revolution in this part with the middle schools. And the fact of the matter is that the money that was being taxed in the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all these other things is not being spent there in Massachusetts where it's being collected. It's getting sent back to London. So as far as they're concerned, that's not right. As far as the British are concerned, they're perfectly justified because they've spent millions in their day saving those colonists during the French and Indian War, and they put out a lot of money, and so now they're trying to recoup the investment. But again, the Americans are the only ones paying this, and they haven't had the right to vote on that. And meanwhile, back in England, they're going, well, we spent all this money, and it's good to have this money come back here, and then the colonists really don't have the right to make a decision. We saved them. And again, to the Americans, they feel like they're, a loved dog maybe in some ways, but they're not a full and equal British citizen. And that's what's going to lead to independence. All right, I get a little off the track there, but here we go. You know what I'm talking about. So election integrity is a word that's being used these days. How do we guarantee the integrity of our elections? In those days, it was easy. You knew everybody. You knew who the people were. You saw them vote out there. You know who they voted for. All the elections were local. You chose successful people. When you look at the people who are at the Second Continental Congress that vote independence, at the Constitutional Convention, they're the most known and usually the most successful people. And so that's who you're going to send, because they're going to look out for the economic interests of everyone else who owns property, has a business, has a stake in what's going on in that state. So that's how you chose people to go to your elected government in these different colonies during that time. And like I said, you're going to have to own property. Now, that can come at any time, especially if you're male. Those of you who've seen some of the portrayals, for instance, the one in the John Adams series where they're discussing independence, or the one in 1776, one of the younger guys there was a guy named Edmund Rutledge. He's 30 years old. Yeah, he's one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. Because remember, your average lifespan at this time is somewhere in the low 30s, maybe mid 40s. So it wouldn't be unusual at all for a 10 or 12-year-old boy to pretty soon be an inheritor of that estate. Now, in the beginning, you'll have a manager that'll help manage it, but once he reaches majority, he's got all the power in that. So, 30-year-old Edmund Rutledge is a big cheese at that point in time in the South Carolina delegation. And those property owners are the only taxpayers. So if you pay taxes, you're the only one that should be allowed to determine what it's spent on. That's the thought. Now, the Constitution changes everything. And one of the things that we sometimes forget, and I know this group is better than most of us, but I think most of our fellow Americans, unfortunately, are being intentionally left, shall we say, ignorant of our history and the necessity of understanding that to understand the country that we have today. When the revolution ends, we are not the United States of America. When the revolution ends, Massachusetts has its own constitution, has its own republic. South Carolina has its own constitution, its own republic. Now, we have this Articles of Confederation, which are supposed to help us be able to have these ideas of friendship with each other. We're not going to go to war with each other. It's kind of like almost a balkanized North America. And right away, they start having problems. France decides they're going to have a little fun with them and sends 13 ambassadors over to the New World. And a lot of people are just expecting this whole thing to be a mess. So when the Constitution is formed to put together this new federal government, the idea is that we need this federal government to do certain things that we can't do individually, like regulate trade, like coin currency, like fight a war if need to with an army and a navy to protect us, and on and on. Now, these are the 18 expressed powers that Congress has in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, okay? And so once that happens, now you have to figure out, all right, how is this going to work? The Constitution Convention had a difficult problem to solve. And the problem is, how do we represent the views of the people at large? And at the same time, the views of each individual state. And at first it was, well, we're going to do it by people. And that was the big states who were deciding that. Virginia was in favor of that. Massachusetts was in favor of that. Pennsylvania, they're the ones that have all the people. And then Rhode Island said, well, we're not even going to show up. We know what's going to happen in this convention. They didn't. Rhode Island was not at the Constitutional Convention. So you come up with this idea. You're going to have two bodies in Congress. One for the people. The population is going to determine how many of those people are in there and how many of them are from each state. And then the Senate. Whether you're Rhode Island or New York or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, you get two senators. And that's where the states have their voices. And the brilliance of that, and some people who are trying to change this do not understand the brilliance of that. The brilliance of that is that you do not get anything that becomes a law without the majority of the people approving it and the majority of the states approving it. And then you have one more check, even the president looking at, is this a harebrained thing that people are doing because they're feeling emotional, or is this a good idea? So the more people have in it, it's going to make it, hopefully moderate it where it needs to be. So that's how the Constitution changes elections. Each state has its own election rules. If Missouri decided, for whatever reason, that we wanted the person who receives the electoral votes for the presidency to be decided by the governor of Missouri, and the Missouri legislature passed that bill and the governor signed it, that's the way it would be. Each state has up to them how to do this, okay? And that's because in this specific case, when they were thinking about a president and the executive, that he was the president of the United States of America. He's representing that whole body, that whole group that has kind of agreed to be a country. And so we want him to be chosen by the states. We don't want him to be chosen by the largest cities. We don't want him to be chosen by the states with the biggest populations. We want all the states to feel like they've had a hand in choosing who the chief executive is, because the powers we've given him, or the biggest power he has, is the power to use the military. He is the commander in chief. Now, Congress has to declare war, but think about it, folks. When was the last time Congress filed the declaration of war? December 7th, 1941. Now, we've had times where we've decided to use military, and sometimes the president says, this may be a long time, so I'm going to go to you, Congress, and make sure that you're okay with this. We've kind of done that with the War Powers Act after Vietnam anyway. But there's a reason why we didn't use the popular vote. One of the things that Madison was concerned about when he formed the Constitution was what he called the tyranny of the majority. What he was most afraid of was minorities being protected, which is a different thing when he says it than what people think they are hearing when they hear that today. And the minority, we're talking about a minority of any kind of vote. So if you have a vote, you don't want to vote for war to be something like 51-49 or something like that. You want to feel like the country's really behind that. And so to have the states choose the president was the intent. The Electoral College was simply a way to make that a function of the voting that's already gone on. So when you go to vote, for instance, in 2024 for the next president of the United States, or to re-elect the president of the United States, you are not voting for that person. You are voting for a slate of electors that person has put up before the legislature of that state to stand as electors who would be the chosen electors if that person wins that state. Okay? And there are 2 states that don't even give you all the votes if you win it. Both Maine and Nebraska do what's called proportional vote. You have to win the state to get a couple of electoral votes, and then you get one for each congressional district in that state that you win. And all the others, it's winner take all. Okay? So anyway, every once in a while we hear this thing about, oh, we should go to the popular vote. Oh, we should go. That's a bad idea, because then you've got the minority thinking that these concentrations of the population are going to be the ones who are going to choose the president, which means that those interests will get addressed first and foremost. And they understood that. They didn't think it was going to be as populated as it's gotten and that our cities would get as big as they are, but they understood certainly regionally the things that they would be concerned about. So it says in there, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. So whenever you say, well, how many electoral votes does this state have? And somebody says, well, it's 13, that means 2 senators, and they have 11 congressmen in that state. I think Missouri's 9. We used to have 10, and we lost one recently. So 8, is it 8? Now, I knew we lost one. So we've got six congressmen and 2 senators. So that's the way that.
Sorry, eight congressmen. I mean, so we'd have 10.
So it's 10. It used to be 11. I knew that we lost one recently. All right. And then in the beginning, some legislatures said, well, we're just going to appoint him, which is easy the first couple elections because you knew who's going to be George Washington. You're never again going to have a president elected, unanimously, but we did at that time, and that made a lot of sense. People, from Massachusetts all the way down to South Carolina trusted him. They had been there with him during the war. They knew he was fair. They trusted him. Okay. But our third election almost broke the system. Okay, you know the story a little bit. I can already tell by the sounds coming in. So Washington had to be persuaded to even run for the second term. He just couldn't wait to go back to Mount Vernon. I mean, that's what he wanted to be. He was a gentleman farmer. But he felt it was his duty. He had been talked into it by Hamilton and us. And no. If you leave now, it's all going to fall apart. You got to run for a second term. Okay. So he ran for his 2 terms and he said, I'm done. And if you've ever seen the John Adams series, there's this wonderful moment where John Adams has been sworn in as president. And Washington leans over to him. I've been trying to find out whether it's true or not. I got a feeling it's in McCulloch's, but I haven't found it. But anyway, he says, I, sir, am fairly out, and you are fairly in, and we shall see which of us is the happiest. And he's got this big smile on his face. And Adams is going, oh my gosh, I got to follow George Washington as president. And of course, who's waiting in the wings but Thomas Jefferson? How'd you like to be in that sandwich? So anyway, there we are in the 1796 campaign. This is the way it used to be done. Can you imagine this today? I always have fun with my kids with this. If you got first, you were president. Second was vice president. Imagine President Donald Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton. President Joseph Biden and Vice President Donald Trump. Yeah, all those would work well, wouldn't it? Yes. And this is where we're going to find that out. But again, you didn't even have parties at this time. This is coming. Because to a great extent, you've got all these guys who had fought hard in the revolution and had worked with each other to get that independence. It was such a big deal. But now that you no longer have that common goal that everyone is, willing to sweat blood and put it all on the line, now you begin to see the guys that have a different vision. Okay? And so John Adams is running basically, he's not really a party man, but he's the guy who's representing the Federalist Party at that time. Washington hated parties. He didn't want any part of it. And he was right to hate parties. And running against him, kind of, if you will, is Thomas Jefferson. And his party is called the Democratic Republican Party. Eventually, they will drop the Republican part under Andrew Jackson. It just becomes the Democratic Party. So that's how it starts. Jefferson and Jackson are the founders of that party, although they're both persona non grata to be mentioned at the Democratic Party. That's another conversation. Okay, so in the 96 campaign left Adams and his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, as his vice president. And Jefferson spent most of the time at Monticello or fomenting through different newspapers that he was connected to negative commentary about Adams. And this is really sad because these guys were close. I mean, they'd worked hard for independence. They both had been ambassadors to France. They were part of the team that negotiated the Treaty of Paris to end the war. And at that time, Abigail came over. It was right after Jefferson's wife had passed on. And so they almost became like a family because Jefferson was grieving the loss of his wife so hard that Mrs. Adams called him Thomas. And you did not do that in those days, except the family. You didn't refer to people, it's always, oh, Mr. Jefferson, how nice to see you again. Thomas. That gave you an idea of how closely they felt. And then in the 00 election, after all this fomenting behind the scenes, and most of that fomenting had nothing to do with Adams. In fact, Adams was getting stabbed in the back by the head of his party. The head of the Federalist Party was ostensibly Alexander Hamilton. All the people in the cabinet, it was Washington's former cabinet, were all people that Hamilton had suggested to Washington. Pick this guy, pick this guy. So they're all owe their job to Hamilton, and he doesn't like Adams. He thinks Adams not up to the job. And if you've read the David McCulloch book, which won the Pulitzer Prize for good reason, you see a lot about this. But it's the most vicious one in history. And the reason is because by this point in time, you had really diametrically opposing views of where this country was headed. And I spent a lot of this week telling both of my classes about this because there's some of the things that we still have in our ideological differences as a nation today. How do you see the Constitution? Well, you'll have to interpret. It's got to be written in there or else it's not in the Constitution, and then you'd have to pass a law. Well, I think we can interpret a broad interpretation. If it means this, then it can be applied to all these other things. So the first one I described to you is what's called strict construction. If it's not in there, it's not a power given to the federal government. That's actually in the 10th Amendment, okay? So Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans are strict constructionists. But Hamilton and the Federalists are broad constructs. Well, we think we can interpret this. Well, we think this power is given to the federal government. Of course, that means if we can build a fort here, that means we can tell you we can take your land and build a fort and all this sort of stuff. So, and other things are going on that lead to these breaks as well. Jefferson had been over in France. He'd been there at the beginning of the French Revolution. He had a really strong place in his heart for the French Revolution. And so he's kind of a Francophile. Hamilton looks at the French and, the mob are, chopping off heads like crazy, and they have no control, and they're attacking all the monarchies in Europe. And you have to understand, Hamilton wanted George Washington to take a crown. Washington said, no, we just fought to get rid of a crown. But Hamilton's a bit of a monarchist. Okay? So that's another thing that puts them apart. So you've got Adams, who's in the Federalist Party, and even though he's not really with them like Hamilton is, he is the head of the Federalist Party because he's president. And you got Jefferson, who's the head of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, during this period of time, the Federalists are in control of Congress. And you have to understand that at this time in our history, we saw things very differently. We look today, the kids I know see this way. Most Americans see this way. We've got a problem. Inflation's bad. The economy's bad. There's war in Ukraine. What's the president going to do about it? You didn't think that way in those. The Congress was where all the power was. That's why it's the first article in the Constitution. That's why there's 10 sections to that first article. Their view was the Congress is the voice of the people. That's where most of the power is going to be settled. It's only in the last 100 years or so that we've taken a different view of the powers of the presidency. So when the Federalist Congress passes two pieces of legislation, even though lawyer John Adams thinks it's a bad idea and it may not even be constitutional, he signs it anyway. The first was called the Alien Act, which basically would have said, now it's going to take you longer once you come here as an immigrant before you become a citizen. Why did the Federalists do that? Because it would take longer for these new immigrants who are overwhelmingly becoming Democratic Republicans. Okay, so it'll take longer for them to be citizens. And number two is what we call the Sedition Act. Now, this is the Sedition Act of 1798. There's a second one in 1918. That's for another discussion another time during World War I. But in this one, it says any criticism of the government can land you in prison. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Well, what happened to the First Amendment? Freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Yes, but during wartime, according to this period of time, remember, I tell the kids this. I said, these guys are running the government looking at the rule book. You've done that first couple times you play a board game. You're kind of going, wait a minute. Oh, we blew it. We're supposed to do this and move. And it's like, all right, move back a few spaces. That's what's going on here. The rule book was written, but now they actually have to put it into fact here. And so at this point in time, well, of course there's free speech. Of course there's free press. But at this time, we were in an undeclared war with France. France was attacking a lot of our vessels because we were doing a lot of trade with their enemy, England. And so with this undeclared war going on, if you're criticizing the government during wartime, can you imagine? Jane Fonda and the Sedition Act, that would have been a problem. Anyway, if you bad Keith, if you are criticizing the government, then you're breaking the law. And there actually were newspaper publishers who favored the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson who were tried and went to prison during this time period because of the Sedition Act. So believe me, you all know what happens eventually. Jefferson does become president, and boy, does he pardon those guys and move that out there. And they, repeal the Sedition Act and everybody. But anyway, it's one of the reasons probably Adams lost this election because of the Sedition Act. People felt it was going too far. Now, during the campaign, it was even worse. When the Federalist Papers wrote about Jefferson, they called him the atheist danger. He was a deist, but he wasn't a member of any church. He didn't attend church. So we said, be careful. Thomas Jefferson as president would be the atheist danger. It's also with, okay, here we go. Now we're more like normal days today. Now, the first time you got the scandal talked about that, well, we hear that he's got a girlfriend, Sally Hemings, who's one of the slaves, and all this, got a couple of kids and everything. By the way, I don't know how many of you know, Sally Hemings is actually his wife's stepsister. Jefferson's wife, fathered both Jefferson's wife and one of his slaves. And that's who Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not saying that, I'm just saying it's one of those interesting things that you find out when you dig more into history and find that out. Anyway, that was brought up, that he had sort of a live-in who was one of his slaves. Now, what they said about Adams in the papers was that Adams was a hermaphrodite. So that, I think it's hard to say that you could get more mudslinging than that. And this is the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson.
There's a great, at least one YouTube video where they play out a reading of some of the political ads from the election of 1800.
It is
video accompaniment.
And the fact of the matter is, it's plain that both parties subsidized those papers. And wasn't just they were, like a New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, whatever. These were papers that were set up to be the mouthpiece of that party, and they're shoving money towards them. And so, in essence, because you paid for it, that's Jefferson saying that about Adams, and that's Adams saying that about Jefferson. Okay. Now, there's a crazy finish to that election that most Americans don't know. Most Americans just know, and then Adams lost, and Jefferson's president. Whoops, you left out kind of the wild part of this. Okay, so remember again, the way it works at this time, we haven't changed it yet. First place is president. Second place is vice president. However, by this point in time, they were getting ballots in electoral colleges. You get 2 votes. Okay? And of course, if I'm a Federalist, I'm going to vote for 2 Federalists. And if I'm a Democratic Republican, I vote for 2 Democratic Republicans. Except somebody needs to have at least 1 vote for somebody else. Because what ends up happening, while the Democratic Republican Party wins the big victory, the fact is it's a tie. Because they all voted for Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who were the Democratic Republican nominees for president. So what ends up happening is that you have an election. They look at, again, here we are, the roll book. Okay, what do we do? Oh, tie, what do we do here? Oh, it goes to the House of Representatives. Okay, well, we can do that. Let the people decide. But it's the old House of Representatives. The Federalists got their clock cleaned in that election, but the Democratic Republicans have not taken the seats yet. So here you've got a Congress. No, wait, it gets better. Here you've got a Congress full of these Federalists. Fortunately for them, you vote by state, 1 vote per state. So for 36 ballots, it's a tie. Until Hamilton comes in and grabs one of the Federalist states and say, you're going to abstain this one. I'm not crazy about Jefferson, but I do not trust Burr. I wonder if he looked into the future. Yeah. So I do not trust Burr. So that's what happens. Somebody changed their vote, and after 36 votes, on the 37th, Jefferson is elected president. Now, who do you think got robbed? I should be president. And he finds out, of course, who it was that made this happen. Alexander Hamilton. Now, that's not why he shot him. That comes later on, but it begins the feud. Okay? It begins the feud. Ultimately, that secret deal is that began him on the road. Even though he disagreed with Jefferson, he feared Burr, and Burr was ambitious. He's right. How many of you know a little bit about Aaron Burr? I mean, the guy was tried for treason, and he was guilty. But the Constitution says you can only be convicted of treason on the votes of 2 witnesses to 1 act. And the fact of the matter is he had made a deal with the territorial governor of Louisiana, but only he and the governor were at that meeting. So because there was not 2 votes, the Chief Justice of the United States, who presided the trial, as John Marshall, said, well, I'm looking at the rule book. There's got to be 2. There's only 1. He's acquitted. So he got off. Okay. He was trying to take a part of Louisiana and make his own little country. I mean, here's a fascinating story.
The Republic of West Florida.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a great story. And someday somebody will find out and make a really great movie about that, because it's a wild one. But anyway, that gentleman's agreement. Now, it had been offered to Burr, and he turned it down. Okay, but still, he thought he was going to win somehow. So when he found out that it was all about Hamilton's work, that's, as I said, he has a long memory. All right, so that's the 1800 election. Okay, now the next one 1824, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. Okay, he's also been in the Congress for a while, and they have an election that year, and holy cow, it's a wild one because there's now just kind of one party. I didn't talk too much about the Federalists. The Federalists, I don't want to get too much in that, but they backed the wrong horse in the War of 1812 and that ended up killing the party. Okay, let's just put it that way. So you've got, you don't have nominating conventions yet. So it's just, I want to run for president and I'm going to be the nominee of a number of people who are going to support me. So there's the Northern Democrats, and out of them comes a nominee from Massachusetts, John Quincy Adams. There's Andrew Jackson, who is from Tennessee. Then there's Henry Clay, who's from Kentucky, right next to Tennessee. And then a guy named Crawford from South Carolina, who doesn't get as many votes and also has a stroke in between the time of the election and the inauguration. So again, there's no big winner. In other words, nobody has a majority of votes. The guy who had the most was Jackson. And so Jackson naturally thinks, okay, the rules are that when you go to the House of Representatives, only the top 3 vote getters get to choose. Now, Crawford, even though he's got problems, he was 3rd. Henry Clay is 4th. So Henry Clay is out. But Henry Clay has friends in Congress. Okay, he was one of the original war hawks in the War of 1812.
Was he Speaker of the House at that time?
I think he was. But what's really going to be interesting is what he gets after this, okay? So Jackson, he's feeling his oats right now. I got the most votes. I can probably persuade Clay from the neighboring Kentucky to vote for me. South Carolina, maybe I can persuade them. I should be elected president. And then also a general change had come across the country. Most states were getting rid of their property requirement to vote, which is one of the reasons why Jackson had gotten so many votes. So now you had all the guys without property who looked at Andrew Jackson and said, Andrew Jackson, we're hero of New Orleans. He's my guy. Not realizing that Andrew Jackson is one of the most wealthiest guys in Tennessee because he owns so much land. But that's all right. Sometimes the man of the people ends up being a guy who's a billionaire, right? Anyway, so this is where we stand. And Jackson's feeling pretty good about his chances. And once again, it's the Constitution that comes in here. Now, the 12th Amendment, which was done after the 1800 election, had changed all these things. Now you run as a ticket. It's a president and vice president deal. And the person having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 people, are the ones who go on. So the 4th guy's left off. That's Henry Clay. Okay. And it also says in here, on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose out of those 3. Okay, so since Clay is out, Clay has the opportunity to be kingmaker. And Jackson's assuming that Clay is going to go with him. As I said, Crawford's out because of his stroke. And the Electoral College chooses John Quincy Adams. So Jackson and his people are going, what the heck happened? It should have been us. Number one, Clay has a big influence on Congress. As you said, I think he was House Speaker at that time. I don't think it had the power that it now does, but it certainly was the guy who was most respected by the other congressmen. And of course, that's in the House of Representatives. Remember, this is not happening in the Senate. This is happening in the House. It's kind of interesting right there. Number 2, they think Jackson is a demagogue. Where have we heard that term before? So they're scared of him. They're scared of him. And number 3, he throws his support to Adams after Adams has made him his Secretary of State. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but in those days, that was the path. Today, we think of the vice presidency of the path. Biden was Obama's vice president, then George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? That was the ticket then, was Secretary of State. Washington, his Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, his Secretary of State was Madison. Madison, his Secretary of State was Monroe. Monroe, his Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. So as far as Jackson's people are concerned, John Quincy Adams is basically deciding that his successor someday will be Henry Clay. And that's why the Jackson people called the election of 1824 the corrupt bargain, okay? That a deal had been struck. Now, people have looked into this. They see nothing saying, you know, there's a deal in exchange for this type of thing. I think, knowing John Quincy Adams, he's a pretty straight arrow. And I think you looked at the people who could be a Secretary of State who had some experience with foreign affairs. Henry Clay is a good choice there. But of course, to Jackson and his people, you know, they decided after that they were going to ruin John Quincy Adams' presidency. And they did. They did everything they could to ruin his presidency, and he was nowhere to be seen in the 1828 election. That went heavily to Andrew Jackson. So in those days, the Secretary of State is the heir apparent to the White House, and Jackson's supporters felt he was robbed, and he got political revenge on President John Quincy Adams. All right, the election 1840, the importance of the choice of the vice president. This is a big deal. And that is that you went out at that time and you tried to find somebody who was going to be loved as a man of the people. And they found William Henry Harrison, who had the nickname of Old Tippecanoe, because he had been the general who had led the successful battle of Tippecanoe, or where the British allied Indians were wiped out, and he was a hero. In actuality, they made this whole thing of, he lived in a log cabin and he drank hard cider and all this sort of stuff. Not true. He had been born in Virginia. He was territorial governor of Ohio. He was a very wealthy man. But hey, it was great marketing, okay? And so he was known as Old Tippecanoe. And so what do we do to try to make sure that we win it? And this is, you hear people talking about this. We need to balance the ticket. So Harrison's considered a Westerner. I know it's funny to think of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois as West, but Harrison's considered a Westerner. And John Tyler was a former Democrat who was willing to, he had problems with his own party. He switched to become a Whig. And so William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, said, you will be my running mate on the ticket. You're my Whig vice presidential candidate. And everyone knew that he probably was going to win well. He's a Southerner from Virginia. Now, Harrison's the one who's famous for giving a 2-hour inaugural speech in the cold rain in March of 1841, and 30 days later, he's dead. Okay? Shortest presidency on record. Oops. And now what do they have? They have the Whig presidents died, and the former Democrat who is now president for almost a full term, and he governs like a Southern Democrat, and the Whigs were tearing their hairs out. The Whig is largely, they're a party of the West and some areas of the North, and they believe in tariffs and they believe in infrastructure and all this sort of stuff. They do not want to have anything to do with a Southern gentleman from the South who's all about cotton and, slavery's okay and all that. They're absolutely beside themselves. So neither party wants John Tyler, okay? Neither party. The Democrats don't want him back, and the Whigs don't trust him anymore. So it's a very lonely presidency for him now. Later in his life, right before he passed on, he spent a couple of months as a member of the Confederate Congress. So that gives you an idea where John Tyler is as far as his ideology and stuff. And again, the importance of who you pick for your vice president is really important. It's really important because you just don't know what's going to happen. And who knew that we're going to lose good old Tippecanoe so quickly. All right. The election of 1860. Now, most of you probably figure, well, I know this one. This is Lincoln and all this sort of stuff. This is pretty cut and dried. It's anything but cut and dried. It's quite a story about it happening. It's amazing that we survived this election. And then I'll tell you about the next one after that. So it ends up being a 4-way race. Because when the Democrats have their convention, the Northern Democrats, okay, we can be flexible on slavery, but the Southern Democrats have no flexibility at all. It stays or that's it, and we don't trust you, and they split. And then there's the border states who go, we have slavery, we're Southerners, but we want to maintain our economic ties to, the North, because that's where the money is. And so who are we talking about? We're talking about Missouri. We're talking about Kentucky. We're talking about Maryland. We're talking about Delaware. Yes, Delaware was a slave state. Most Americans don't know that either, okay? So those are the border states. So you end up getting 4 candidates that really do represent these regions well. The Constitutional Union Party says, I don't want to talk about slavery. This is all about preserving the Union. Leave slavery alone. We'll figure that out sooner or later, but now's not the time, okay? That's the Constitutional Union Party. Then you have the Republicans. This is a new party. This is only the second time they've had a presidential candidate. The first one was John C. Fremont, the Western frontiersman in 1856. And so now somehow they come up with this guy Lincoln, and it's quite a story. All the guys in Lincoln's cabinet, as you all know, were the guys that I should be president, not that guy. Okay, but Lincoln's pretty shrewd, and took a good word, biding his time, and ends up being the nominee of the Republican Party. And problem you have now, I didn't mention the other two. I didn't mention Stephen Douglas, who's the Northern Democrat nominee, and then you have John C. Breckinridge, who's the Southern Democrat nominee. Now, here's where our system got to kind of a funky situation. And that is, you have to have a slate of electors in order to be on the ballot. You have to have a number of people equal the number of electoral votes to say, yes, I will be an elector for Stephen Douglas. I will be an elector for John Bell, who's the Constitutional Union guy. But down in 10 of the 11 states that are going to make up the Confederacy, there is nobody that wanted to be an elector for Abraham Lincoln. So in 10 of the 11 states that eventually will become the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln didn't get a single vote because he was not on the ballot. Now, remember again, it's not even a ballot, right? They're all standing there at the town square raising their hand. And how many for Abraham Lincoln? Put your hand back down. That's the way it was in those 10 states. So here's Lincoln, gets elected president with 40% of the vote and didn't get a single vote in these 10 states. So they all knew what was coming. Once this happened, they all knew, even the Southerners knew that this was going to be the result. But again, this was their honor, and so he gets 40% of the vote, 180 electoral votes, and the other three get a combination of 123. So it was a solid electoral victory.
40% is generous. It was low.
Maybe 38 or so, and there's no question that the numbers, the numbers. So they say, oh, let's just bump it up to 40. 40 looks better. But anyway, that's in most of the history books. So 40% of the vote, and he gets elected. Now, it's the next one to me that's really fascinating. Remember, this is an election happening with a third of the country left. There's not going to be any voting for president of the United States in those 11 states south of the Mason-Dixon line. The border states will vote. Obviously, the northern states will vote. We've added a couple of more states in the West. I think we added Nevada and Oregon either right before or right after the beginning of the Civil War. And so the election of 1864 is going to be interesting. And we look at it and go, yeah, Lincoln won an election. That was not a given. In fact, his own party found him unpopular. The war had been going on for almost 4 years, and that year was the worst casualties ever. That's when Lee and Grant are just bludgeoning each other in Northern Virginia. And the casualty lists are unbelievable. And everyone's certain that Lincoln's going to be defeated. And who's running against him in the Democratic Party? Yeah, the generally filed, General George McClellan. Everybody's, wow, he can't do any worse than Lincoln himself is doing. Well, let's vote for Little Mac, as they called him in those days. So the war was going really badly. It was very bloody. And the party actually asked him to step down. Why don't you step down? Let someone else go. Well, who do you want me to run? Well, Grant. Oh, I don't think Grant wants it. And he was right. At that time, Grant wouldn't have taken it. But that's what the party was thinking at that time. Now, what changed it is events, as Harold Macmillan once said when asked about what could change between now and Election Day. Events, my boy, events. And the event was the September 3rd surrender of Atlanta to William Sherman. Once that happened, it was clear to everyone, this is the last months of the war. Because Sherman did his march to the sea, and he was going to destroy the South's ability to make war, and it was just waiting for springtime to come and Grant to finish off Lee. But up until that point in time, it was not at all sure. And in order to make sure, because you didn't have polling in those days, well, I think we need to send more money to Ohio or whatever it is. Didn't have polling. So in order to make sure that you had majorities in some of these states, because remember, a lot of the voters were where? Fighting the war. So they would get leave right around election time. There weren't many battles in November anyway. And Secretary of War Stanton sent them over in different, especially in some of these border states like West Virginia and Missouri and Maryland, to vote in those states to make sure that Lincoln got enough votes to win the election. Now, was that illegal? Or no, it was completely. What's amazing is we had an election in the middle of a civil war. So when people say to me, boy, we've never been more divided, I go, you want to bet? And oh, it's never been worse in this country. How can we have an election now? We had an election in the middle of a civil war. And what I think is amazing is that we said, look, this is the way we do things. And yeah, we got a civil war, but we're going to have an election. We're going to elect a president. And then, whatever the decision is. And McClellan won. He said he was going to sign a peace treaty with the South. And I believe he probably would have. All right.
There was one other thing there is that I found out that in the Confederate Constitution, their president
6-year term, wasn't
it? 5.
Five.
It was
one term.
Yeah, one term, only one term. So in 1864, throughout the year of 1864, Abraham Lincoln is up for re-election, and Jefferson
Davis doesn't have to. It's a good thing too.
At all.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting.
Priorities.
There's a lot of things that are similar in the Confederate Constitution. That was not one of them. Okay, what is known as the fraud of the century, and there's no way to get around this one. And it's kind of ugly. It's kind of unfortunate, but you should know about it. And certainly your students will be hearing about it if they get to this part, depending on the class syllabus. Okay, so after the Civil War, gradually the southern states, one by one, have to meet certain requirements to be readmitted to the Union. And that's happening. And all but a few of them are fully admitted. The problem is that you can know that the Republicans knew, let's drag this out if we can, because they're all going to vote solidly Democrat. Why? Because the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. And I was married for a while to a Southerner, and it's still that way in some of those places down there. Oh, my grandpappy would be horrified if he'd known I voted for a Republican. This was somebody who was voting for Ronald Reagan or Bush or something like that. But I mean, that's the way it was for a long period of time. You did not vote Republican. Those were the oppressors. Those were the invaders, the attackers. So they knew as they let these states come back in, more and more of those congressional seats and those Senate seats are going to be Democrats filling those up. So they're taking their time. Now, after 2 terms of Grant, in 1876, the Republicans nominated Governor Hayes of Ohio, who had been a Civil War general, and the Democrats nominated a reformer governor of New York, Samuel Tilden. And for the first time, there's a possibility, especially with these southern states starting to come back in with electoral votes, that the Democrat might win. And New York is becoming more and more Democrat because of all the immigrants that have been coming into the country and will be voting Democrat. But the main worry of a lot of the Republicans was that this was also going to lead to KKK members perhaps getting elected to the Senate or to the House, and they were concerned. At least that's what they said on the foreground. So the election comes up in 1876, and there are still 3 states that are not certain of their results, and all 3 of them are in the South. And if all 3 of those states vote for the Republican, Hayes will win the presidency by 1 vote. Okay? So what does Congress do in situations like that? We form a committee. And so the committee is formed. Now, at this point in time, the Republicans are still the old Congress. So the old Congress says, well, we're going to have a committee. We're going to have 15 members. And 8 of them are going to be Republicans, and 7 of them are going to be Democrats. Okay? So that's what happens. Now, the committee goes down and interviews all these people and all the votes and is examining this, election integrity, yada, yada, yada. And so the decision is made. A deal is cut with those 3 states and the South. Give us those 3 states, and President Hayes will become president of the United States. And in exchange for that, the occupation that's been going on during Reconstruction will end. All the federal, most of people don't even know that federal troops were in the South for quite a bit of time after the end of the Civil War as part of Reconstruction. We talk about that now. Our last unit with the middle school is here, so it will be about Reconstruction. So the occupation, all the federal troops will leave, and they'll go back up north. The patronage, the opportunity to reward federal employment to people in order to, get elected next time, will return to the South. Until now, patronage has been in the hands of the North. Okay, you can have the patronage jobs. You can do that again. And then finally, you're going to have those votes, and then he'll become president. And unfortunately for Hayes, he had nothing to do with this. He's just the recipient of it. There's nothing he could have done even if he wanted to. This was a deal that his Congress made. But for the rest of his 4-year term, he was called his fraudulency, or Rutherford B. Hayes. And it's kind of unfortunate because he was a straight arrow, but he was the recipient of this deal.
Wasn't in the sections 2 and 3 of the 14th Amendment determines not only who is a citizen, but who's not a citizen.
Right.
And having been engaged in an act of
Yeah,
rebellion.
brilliant. Yeah, they're trying to use that against some of the January 6th people.
Well,
yes.
yeah, is that the southern state, a huge, massive parts of the voting blocks of the southern states could not vote.
Right.
And they're out.
That's going to get restored.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the deal, is that gets restored. And besides that, you had, when Johnson became president after Lincoln, he was just pardoning people wholesale.
Okay.
To give them their voting rights back. So anyway, it's a sad story. There is actually a book that I remember reading a number of years ago called Fraud of the Century, but that 1876 election is bad. I know I'm a little long here, so I'm going to move very quickly here. The Gilded Age, when we talk about voter fraud, it really is, when we think of that, we usually think of the urban cities. The flood of immigrants coming into the cities in the later part of the 19th century was so bad that the regular government, your city aldermen, et cetera, they ignored them because they didn't have money, they didn't have power. However, what they did have is votes. And so the city bosses, who were the unofficial guys running things, in this case, Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, figures out that he's got an opportunity here to get all sorts of deals done for his buddies that will do financial jobs and industry, and in exchange for that, we're going to get them all elected because all these immigrants are going to get the benefit in exchange for their vote. They're going to get help with immigration. They're going to get help with food. They're going to get help with housing. They're going to get help with grandma in exchange for, it says ballots, but again, votes. We're not really doing ballots at this time in exchange for votes. And so the poll workers took advantage of that. And so that's why you constantly had these city bosses that were almost permanently in power because of the situation of being able to use the franchise in order to keep the city machine going. And this is, many of you know, those Thomas Nast cartoons that are great in the Gilded Age here. And this is one of Boss Tweed again. It says, that's what's the matter. It says, Boss Tweed says, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it anyway? Is supposedly the idea there. All right. The election of 1888. This is the one that I think you'll find pretty interesting. Governor Cleveland is the incumbent. He's a Democrat. He's a reform Democrat from New York. His main issue that he was concerned about was tariffs. Remember, you don't have an income tax yet. Income tax comes with the 13th Amendment. I'm sorry, not the 13th Amendment. It comes with the 16th Amendment. So the idea is, how does the government get money through tariffs? We put tariffs on all sorts of goods coming in overseas. But of course, that makes the prices go higher. Inflation. Sound familiar? And so the main issue for him was he was against tariffs. That made it harder on the poor people. The Republicans are for tariffs because they are the party of business. And those tariffs will allow American businesses to compete with foreign goods coming in there. Now, both the Democrats and the Republicans over the last couple of elections had started using what they called floaters. And you would identify supporters in states that you weren't worried about carrying and find a way to help them float over the border and vote in other states on the other side. In this case, the Republicans were really wanting to hold on to those tariffs, and they really wanted to see Cleveland go. So you had one senator in particular that paid for a lot of floaters to come into Indiana, into New York, and Ohio from nearby states. And that was enough to give the election to Benjamin Harrison. And that's how Cleveland becomes the only two-term president who did not have consecutive terms. Because in the 1888 election, Harrison's supporters got enough floaters in those states to win the Electoral College, even though they did not win, as we call it now, the popular vote. Okay, so that money that was used to bring in those floaters, it made the difference in the election of 1888. All right, 1960, and we all kind of know this one a little bit, but I'll just go through it really quickly. And again, this is another thing to notice. Most of these contested elections have no incumbent. Okay, if you're running against an incumbent, it's really hard to defeat an incumbent. But where you get these crazy things going on, where neither one of them are already holding the office, so it's kind of a tip ball in basketball. Okay, So here you have Kennedy versus Nixon, and they're both, this is harder for us to think of now, but they're both members of the greatest generation. They're the first ones. Wait a minute, Eisenhower was general. Yeah, but he's a World War I generation guy, okay? He fought in World War I. That's kind of his generation. He's general during World War II. But these are two young guys who fought in World War II, okay? It's the greatest generation. Kennedy versus Nixon. Nixon had been vice president under Eisenhower for 2 terms. And Kennedy, it's a new kind of campaign. You know, he's a good-looking guy. You know, he's very charming. He speaks very glibly. And, you know, a lot of people still think that televised debate made a big difference. Now, we joke a lot about Mayor Daley and the voters and, you know, the dead and the mob and all that stuff. And all I got to say is it's all true. Whether it made a difference, probably not. But there's no question that a lot of shenanigans went on in Chicago. A lot of people who we know were dead ended up voting because somebody grabbed that name, took a ballot for him, and voted it there. You're probably going to win in Illinois anyway. And yes, the mob was involved. If you want to really enjoy an interesting series, watch the series on the Kennedy that was put together by the producers of the 24 show that was on a number of years ago. It's very well done. It's very balanced, too.
I found this on the
I know. Thank you very much, Steve. So anyway, it's all true, but was it the difference in JFK's win? Probably not. But Nixon considered a recount. Eisenhower encouraged him. But in the end, because he wanted to try again, he decided not to, because in his judgment, Americans don't like sore losers. Okay? And so, it worked out. In 1968, he did get his presidency. He did win in another close one, a nail biter at that time. All right. Bush versus Gore. All right, now here's the one you remember now, right? Remember this guy every day, you know, is taking the glasses off, looking at the hanging chads. Is there a dimple there? Many of us remember the problems with Florida actually all night election night. If you don't remember, about 9 o'clock Eastern time, one of the news networks called Florida for Gore. And they knew that that was going to be the difference. And so they called it. And then somebody else said, you can't call it yet because we're not supposed to call them until after the polls are closed. Well, the polls are closed in Florida. Not in the Panhandle, they aren't. So they pulled it back. And by then, the Panhandle is very Republican, still is to this day. And so as the Panhandle votes started to come in, then it flipped on, and now Bush was looking like his win. And so then they called it for Bush. Remember that? Then all of a sudden, no, wait a minute. And, you know, you had this battle going on. And so you remember that night. Nobody called it. And what was it? December when it finally got decided? We went on weeks and weeks of walking. I remember I found this when I did a little internet search, and I thought I'd seen that one time, you know, sore loserman, don't be had by a Chad. Yeah, that's obviously political, but the fact of the matter is just remembering that whole thing that we went through. And the problem was that you had that state with 2 time zones, the hanging chads, the weeks of recounts. Now, here's the thing most people don't know, and shame on you, HBO, for perpetuating this lie. And that is, the problem is the Gore people were not looking for a recount of Florida. They were looking for a recount of certain counties in Florida, the ones where they thought they would get the most votes. And that's the biggest reason why the Supreme Court went ahead and let Florida certification of the election stand. And again, this is part of the problem here, as most people don't understand. The states make their own rules, okay? Most people don't realize that the states make their election rules. Each state has, you know, this whole thing about Georgia, and it's, you know, Jim Crow 2.0. Does everyone know that Georgia's got heavier pre-voting right now than they've ever had with this new rule? So that wasn't true. But the New York Times, I don't know how many of you know this, the New York Times, a couple of months after this thing was all done, went back in and did the recount that the Gore people wanted. And they found out, I think Bush won by 800 some odd votes. If the Gore people had done the recount for the counties they wanted, Bush would have won by more. Well, it was like 1,800 or something like that. But that, you know, people say, well, the Supreme Court gave it. It's not true. It's not true. But it makes for a good film for HBO, so whatever makes him happy. Anyway, Bush won Florida. The Supreme Court let that go forward. And then you had President George W. Bush. All right, so what happened in 2020? Okay, and I promise I'm going to be done in a second. the real key to what happened in 2020 is Molly Ball's article in Time magazine about how the election was fortified. I'll show you that slide in a second here. And that's what concerned everybody. There seemed to be a bipartisan effort to eject an outsider president who wasn't actually loved by either one of the parties. Certainly that has been fortified, if you will, by Senator McConnell's reaction to Mr. Trump's involvement in some of the recent endorsements. Anyway, there were many changes to states' voting procedures without the legislature going through the process of changing the law. Now, that's the thing that's the real problem with what went on. I don't know what, I know people said, well, we saw the votes go like this. That's not unusual to see vote totals change because you're counting your mail-in ballots and that sort of thing. The biggest problem that they had there is the number of states that changed their voting procedures because of COVID without going through the legislative process. And the fact of the matter, people say, well, all the courts reject those. The courts never rejected anything on the basis of the challenge to the way the votes were counted. The court rejection on almost every case was, you don't have standing to be here in front of our court. You have to be able to show that you were damaged in a way by this was decided, and that gives you standing to come and plead before this. And so almost all, especially the Supreme Court rejections they got, were all about standing. They're saying, look, go talk to your states. The states are the ones who have made this decision. This is not for the Supreme Court to do. Our job is federal law unless it interferes with, something in the Constitution. If it's a problem with Florida's decision or Ohio or Nevada or California, those are the guys that have to fix it. So the COVID thing made a big difference. The other thing that was kind of interesting was the huge drop in rejected ballots. Usually you get somewhere between 8 to 9% of ballots that get rejected because one way or another, they're bent, they're not done right. I'm talking about mail-ins, okay? Since a lot of this is about the mail-in ballot that happened because of COVID. And in this case, it was like 0.2%. So there was a huge drop in the number of rejected ballots. That would have been significant. And then the other thing that bothered a lot of people altogether was the number of times that they were starting to count and then they'd put up stuff to close up the windows so people couldn't see what was going on. And that gave people, whether it was something to be suspicious about or not, that made people think that something was silly was going on, that something not right was going on. So, and then, of course, the middle of the night ballot drops. I haven't seen it, but everyone's told me all about the mules thing that Dinesh D'Souza had and those sort of things. I have reasons to think that might have been some difference, but really there's a big difference that went on that was a lot bigger than just a few problems. So for what it's worth, my personal take, this was interesting that Time would even write an article like this. And then the way they said it was the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. That's an unbiased news article. And so right off the bat, you become suspicious. Is there an agenda here? So voting has always worked in American history, even with some of the things that I've told you about here tonight, or some of the things that went on. You're going, that's a little unusual, because the process was transparent enough that the losers accepted the results. And you look at it, you go, well, I voted and they voted and so won, and so we'll move on. And then, we'll take a look and see how it does, and we'll have another election in a few years and see how that goes. But in this case, that's not what happened here. In fact, now the big thing to try to throw on anybody, if they had any doubt about the process in 2020, is to call them an election denier, which is a pejorative that's supposed to say that somehow, you're not a real American, or you're crazy or something like that. So I think it's interesting that just about every Republican victory for president in the last 20 years has been challenged. 2000, 2004, 2016, all were challenged by the Democratic Party. Right up to, in some cases, in 2004, you had people that tried to stop the counting of the electoral college votes. People have forgotten that. I didn't, because it was Ohio at that time, and I was born in Ohio, and I was paying very close attention to this, okay? And where that has not happened in the Democratic victories during that period of time. So the first Democrat victory that was challenged since the 1960s daily tinged win was this most recent 2020. And I'm just saying is that I think until the election laws are cleaned up and the voter rolls are purged, because we're such a mobile nation that some people will be in an apartment complex for 6 months and they'll move, and with these automatic mail out ballots that go out. There are all these ballots that are going to people who are no longer there, and suddenly they get grabbed. And that's what people are worried about. You don't mind getting defeated in an election. You just want to make sure that it was on the up and up and that it was transparent. And that is the end. I'm sorry I went so long. Yes, if it's okay with you. Okay, so she said we can do a little Q&A. Are you kidding? We've been listening to you for an hour and 15 minutes. Yeah.
Just on the concept of voting in part of democracy,
But I'm going to stop right there. And I tell my kids this all the time. We are not a democracy.
True.
And we're a constitutional republic, and there's a big difference. Again, that comes back to the tyranny of the majority thing. And all I'm saying right now, and I will just ask your question, is that I think we always want to be polite. You're going to have to be persuasive if you find yourself in a different situation from other people, no matter what side of it. I can talk to anybody. I mean, I've got my mom was on the left and my dad was on the right, and their discussions about Vietnam were unbelievable, but I learned a lot. But the fact of the matter is people need to understand that it's not a democracy for a reason. And that is because of the tyranny of the majority, what it can do to the minority. Okay, yeah, you were going to have to say.
Well, I was thinking the broader picture of democracy. Can democracy or constitutional republic exist when you have no history of voting? In
Right.
other words, we talk about making Iraq a democracy, or we talk about all these countries making them in democracy. Can they exist, or can that develop when they have no history of voting?
Yeah, each one's going to find its own way. One of the miracles we have looking back on it, look how Germany went from 13 years of Adolf Hitler to, there's no question, it's a thriving republic. You may not agree with it all the time. It's a federal republic. But they've done a good job, which is the Germans. How do we do this best? We're going to do, I can say that. Half of my family is German in the background. But I mean, they've done it their way. Our way is unique. And I tell my kids and any adult I get to speak to at the same time, remember the name of the country. We're the United States of America. And what's going on right now, which people are saying, oh my gosh, we're going to have a civil war. Oh, look at all these people are leaving California, going to Florida. That's fine. That should be the way it is. Now, to a great extent, one of the things that was great about our Constitutional Convention is that we had a number of years of each state with its own constitution, its own way of doing things, who came to that convention and said, okay, we're going to do this for our whole country. Let me try X, and it didn't work. But Y we thought was really helpful. So they would give that input, and they would change the mix that way. We should be doing that. We should be encouraging the idea of federalism. That's how this country was built. And if Californians want to ban their gas-guzzling cars in 2035, God bless them. That's fine. If it works for them, fine. That's federalism. I think they're going to find it doesn't work. By the way, here's my response to that when people talk about we should all own electric cars going to save the planet. All I remember is when they got gas-guzzling cars, nobody said, oh, look, a combustion engine. All right, everybody get rid of your horses. You had a natural evolution where people made a choice and they improved the car and they improved the roads, and all those things happened over time through the marketplace and by the choice of the consumer. And having dictates come down because you happen to have one party rule in one state or another is always a recipe for disaster. So again, I think if we follow our original rule book, and this is why they don't want to teach it. The kids here at Cal will teach. I'm going to have 6 weeks to do the Constitution with the middle schoolers in a couple of weeks, and I'm really excited about it. I'm going to use the high school book I use in the Constitution with them, and we're going to have workbooks, and we're going to talk about cases, and we're going to find out about how the ACLU got its head around defending Nazis at Skokie in 1978, and things like that. Because it's all about the Constitution is over it all, not a person, not a party, not even those houses of government. They all have to answer to the Constitution. And if we use our Constitution and use our federalism that was set up so that you could have a certain amount of freedom to live your life the way you want to, then that's the way it should be. That's the way the country was designed. And it's been working really well until both sides, in some ways, try to tell the other side how they have to live their lives. If it's within the Constitution and within the laws that have been passed by the people in that state, they should have the right to do that. And we start handing down dictates to people and say, this has to be done, you have to live this way, or else, you know, you're an election denier, or you're an enemy of free speech, or whatever it happens to be. No, defend those things. And we have to defend those to our friends and fellow citizens. They are our fellow citizens. And it's hard sometimes, I know. Nobody knows that better than me, because people ask me things all the time, and I don't always say what they want to hear. But they're our fellow citizens. And just, you know, that means we're going to have to speak up. We can't be polite about this one. I mean, that doesn't mean we have to be confrontational, but we can express the strongness of our opinions and say, you know, can you and I talk about this? No, we can't talk about this. Okay, well, I'll be here when you come back, hopefully. Really, I know people, some of you probably sitting here, who had lifelong friends that have fallen out over politics. This should not be going on. It should not be going on. Just keep loving them and keep persuading them and be willing to stand up for your country. This is how, you know, we're not going off to war. The people in this room, I can see by the color right here, we're not going. But this is what we're doing for our children and our grandchildren. We want them to have the country that was founded. And that doesn't hurt anybody. It should bless all. So,
There's a question.
yeah, I'm sorry.
Online.
Oh,
Go check the chat.
that's easier said than done. Let's see. Let's see here. I don't know how to do it. Here it is. Here we go. Okay. Do you think there's a chance for voter transparency like in the 1800s without having to do something like ID chip people to allow the vote and to allow government to keep tabs on people?
Yeah, I think there is. I think most people overwhelmingly, because they don't trust either side, or at least the other side certainly that they're in, are not going to agree to this ID chip thing. That's for our pets that we're afraid we're going to lose. But I do think, well, look, the polling data has shown, I mean, there's not much that we agree on right now overwhelmingly as a country. One of the interesting things that we do agree on overwhelmingly country is things like voter ID and election integrity. You know, for people who might vote, okay, I'm going to use the colors just because it's easier, who vote blue and live in red areas, or people who are red and live in blue areas, they want to make sure that there's election integrity in their area. Okay, they want to make sure that their vote counts. They want to make sure that, you know, there's not a stacked deck against them. And so a lot of that is part of the process of persuading your elected officials that you want this to be addressed. Again, like I said there earlier, and this is something I heard somebody else saying about, well, boy, a bell just rang when he said it. It works in this country because in the past we've had good enough transparency that the losers have accepted the loss. It's not about whether the winners feel great because they won. If the losers don't accept that they lost fairly, that is corrosive to our body politic and to our citizenship. And that, no matter who wins, whichever side, there's enough people here, regardless of how you voted, you've experienced both sides, okay? We've all seen the last 30, 40, 50 years, it's gone different ways. Somebody you might have voted for lost, and somebody you voted against, you won, et cetera, et cetera. So having the transparency that you know it was a fair fight and you lost, you accept that. That's what we've always done, Americans. And then we hopefully move forward. And we don't have to call out our fellow Americans as bad people or that sort of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that shouldn't be. That shouldn't be. You know, when people say that, if they say that to you, they get upset and they find out you find us feel a certain way. You say, I've been your friend for a long time. You know me better than that. They said, let's not let politics divide us. And I think we will get through this. I think we will get through this. We've all, look, Vietnam, guys, they were blowing up the Pentagon. They were, you know, Kent State, a lot of horrible things happened. I knew people that ran to Canada to evade the draft. You know, it doesn't look like that was worse, but in many ways it was. And especially it was a younger generation that was doing that. And, you know, you didn't know what was going to come out of that. So, let's just, here I am. I'm trying to give a little pep talk here. Let's just remember how this nation was founded. The guys that did it did a great job. They really did. They got the Bill of Rights right. I've been telling the kids about that. They came out of the ratification process. We haven't had to change it a lot of times since then because we want the voters to be able to make these decisions. Here's the one. If you've got a family member, either way, that are upset about the Dobbs decision and Roe versus Wade, now our state will get to make its own decision by its elected officials who, if I don't like whichever way they go, I can vote to remove them. I can't vote to remove a Supreme Court justice, but I can affect the state of my legislature. And we'll work through this. You know, we always have. We'll work that. We survived Jim Crow. We survived, a civil war. We'll work through this.
When did they start having secret ballots?
That comes right around the turn of the century, right around the 1900s. And it's going to be a while before it's accepted everywhere. And then some of you probably remember, we got technology after World War II, and you had the little, the things you'd open with the handle, and the curtain would go across, and click, 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 click. And then there would be a little counter in the back, and that's how they count that. I miss those. I actually like those a lot, because I knew when I had voted a certain way that these touchscreens, I go, oh, wait a minute, it's gone. What happened? So, and I think some places, how many of you got places that are going to paper ballots now?
They all are.
Yeah, I think you're going to see more and more of that, whether it's a machine card or something like that. They want to be able to recount something hard that again from the hand, because people they're worried. So I know I've gone on too long. Yeah.
One more question. One more question.
That's not a question.
Comment.
5 years ago, soon I met Francis Kavanaugh, who was the great chief of the Ojibwe Indians up in Canada, and he told us how he was elected. They had different, I think 10 candidates to become the great chief from all the different reserves there. They said they went in a gym, and everybody would go that was there would stand behind the candidate they won. Well, number 9, number 10, the last one, he was out.
No.
And then they come in again and they vote number 8, 9 until
It's almost like a duck goose kind of thing. Yeah.
They got the first and second place guys. Everybody voted, and then it was obvious who was number 1, and then everybody else walked behind number 1.
Now you can do that if everyone has respect for the system and respect for all the candidates, and that's something we need to get back to.
Interesting you talk
Yeah.
about. You know who voted.
Yes,
It's
and you know that the guy who won got the most votes, and
Yeah.
so there's no question about it.
Yeah.
I want to just end on this. It's interesting. I just finished with the middle schoolers talking about the Albany Plan of Union, which was an early attempt to form a union of the colonies right before the French and Indian War. And a lot of that was based on the Iroquois Confederation, because of the way that they had meetings and they had votes and they had selection of their people. So, I know this is up in Canada you're talking, but also a lot of the early decisions we made about certain things came out of what we learned from the native tribes, and particularly the Iroquois Confederation. So, and this is what Americans do. We go, is there a better idea? Somebody's got a better idea? Good, bring it in. Because we're Americans. That's what we want. We want what's best. So I think we will get this figured out. We're going through a rough patch right now. Don't lose hope. Okay. Thank you very much for coming out on Thursday night.
I'm going to end with a quick quote. I just had it. Where did it go? Here it is. So fantastic. This was so timely, and it's just excellent. Thank you so much. What I love is that what we're doing at Cal, what Keith is helping us do, is understanding these laws, and they come from a Judeo-Christian basis. That is the key to me. That is the key of this whole process. And I've been reading a great book, and I wanted to end with this quote, and it's from Robert Winthrop, who was the U.S. Speaker of the House in 1849. He says, "A country can get by with a few external laws if the people have an internal law. And this is the principle of self-government. We are a people of self-government first, and then that trickles out, but it's based on a Judeo-Christian basis. And we celebrate it every single day here. So thank you for celebrating with us tonight. Thank you, Keith. It was this awesome night, and have a wonderful rest of the
See you in January.
See you in January. Yep. Thank you. And thank you all for being on with us. Have a good night.